Good morning. How is everybody this morning? My name is Vicki Hefner, and I'm the education curator here at the Berks History Center. And it's nice to see so many wide awake and smiling people here for our second Saturday program. It's been a busy couple of days here at the Berks History Center. We just finished a Thursday evening event and a Friday morning event. I know Amber Uraldi and I feel like we've almost been sleeping here. It was tough getting out of bed. We had a very successful 2-day photojournalism of the Reading Eagle 60 years. It went really, really well. About 60 people Thursday night and 60 people yesterday. So we're real happy with that. And we're thankful for you being here this morning with us as well. Our second Saturday program in December will be a visit with the Spellschnickel. If you'd like to come in, that'll be on December the 13th. That Thursday, the 11th, we also have a Christmas concert, radio days, World War II music. And I'm kind of winging this, to be honest with you, because like I said, we're really tired. I'm just going to get right away to introducing our speaker this morning. I first want to do a commercial, if I could please, for the Civil War Roundtable of Berks County. We are celebrating our 27th or 28th campaign. 29 years Berks County has had a First Offenders Civil War Roundtable. I have been a member for 8 years. We meet the second Tuesday of each month at Gianotti's on Pricetown Road in Alsace Township. We'd love to have a few new members. We've expanded a little bit in that we've introduced a new topic once or twice a year. We're still Civil War oriented, but we do have Revolutionary War topics or World War II topics, just to have a little bit something different every once in a while. If you would like additional information, you can speak with me, or you can speak with Craig and his wife, Lisa, afterwards. And mentioning afterwards, if you would like a guided tour of the museum after the program today, our volunteer docent, Rick Politica, does tours after our second Saturday programs. They're free, and it lasts about an hour. So on to our program. Craig Breneiser did this program about a year ago for our roundtable, and I really liked it a lot. It has a Berks County connection. So without anything else from me, I'm going to introduce Craig Breneiser. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for that warm welcome. Vicki already stole my commercial. I was going to talk about the First Offenders Civil War Roundtable and a greeting to all of you from them. And as Vicki said, if you're interested in more information about the roundtable, please feel free to speak to me after the program. My wife, Lisa, is sitting in the back. That's primarily so she can sneak out the door and not have to listen to me drone on again. Or it could also be because it's close to the coffee. I'm not sure. I'd like to welcome all of you here. I'd particularly like to send a welcome out to the Hartranft crew, those that are both here or are joining us virtually today, about their ancestor, who's got a key part of the whole reason that we're going to talk this morning. But the title of my program is A Tie That Binds, General John Hartranft. And the Great Exeter Train Wreck, which some of you may be aware of, some of you maybe not, and then beyond, because there's a tie that comes back to all this. As a matter of fact, as a result of standing here waiting to start the program, I've added, and I'll mention at the end of the program, a little bit more of a tie to the entire thing that ties this program into the Berks History Center itself. Our program begins, we're going to go back to the morning of Saturday, May 13th, 1899, in a small rented house, 918 Amity Street in Reading, still stands. So about 200 yards to the east of the Reading rail yards. Many of you, if you're familiar with Reading, we referred to the center of Reading as sort of the Great Wall of China, dividing the Northwest from the Northeast in this huge rail yard back in the heyday of the Reading Railroad, Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, then the Reading Company, Conrail, and it's a shell of itself today, but that rail yard still separates the town. In the early morning hours of Saturday, May 13th, Frank and Sarah Scherer are in this home awaiting the birth of their third child, who would be their second son. Now, we know that back in the day, husbands didn't get to be in the birthing room. They just had to be someplace around. That was the woman's job. That was the doctor's job. There was no breathing. There was no patting the head or anything like that, the modern things that we do with birthing. The father was supposed to be someplace else. So while Frank awaited the birth of his third child and what would turn out to be his second son, he probably noticed, because it was just a short distance away, an unusual amount of activity in the rail yards. He might have noticed some neighbors as the sun came up, talking on the street corners, maybe the newsboys hawking out a special of the Reading papers. And as the natal sounds of his son, who he would name Earl, began, it contrasted dramatically with the sounds a few miles to the south in Exeter Township at the Exeter station, where this gentleman, a few hours before, John Slingloff, the fire chief and a bank president from Norristown, Pennsylvania, had turned to his friends and fellow firefighters, his assistant chiefs, Henry Pagel and P.V. Hoy. And he said to them, "Haven't we had a nice time today?" Those would prove to be the last words that Chief Slingloff would ever speak, because a moment later, 53 tons of a Reading Railroad engine would crash into the back of the car in which he was riding, taking his life and the life of some 26 other people, until all was said and done. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we got to this point, but the thing that ties us together all begins on December 16th, 1830, in a small community of Fagleyville, Pennsylvania, which is north of Pottstown and roughly the size of this room. If you've ever been there, I'm sure you haven't. It's a crossroads, literally. And the Pennsylvania Museum and Historical Commission placed one of their markers there. I'm sure you've seen these markers throughout the Commonwealth, denoting the birthplace of John Frederick Hartranft, who was a Civil War hero, a Pennsylvania governor. It's in Montgomery County, which would be his adopted, well, it was always his home, but it would be his adopted area where he would spend his life. They note that he reorganized the National Guard. We'll talk some more about that as we go on. Now, the interesting thing about this marker is twofold. First of all, if you look at it, it says the same thing on both sides, and it says that the home, the birthplace, is to the right right on the side of the road. So stand on either side of the road, and you would look and go, okay, which way am I supposed to be? And if you would look, you would see fields. Now, in actuality, the home still stands, it's still occupied. It's about a half mile down the road. Now, why the Historical Museum Commission decided to place it here as opposed to at the home is anyone's guess. But it's the government. I worked for the government for 29 years, and don't question what they're doing because they don't know either. John Hartranft would eventually move to Norristown, Pennsylvania, to help with his father's business. He had an interest in civil engineering and would matriculate at Union College, but he became bored with the idea of engineering, in all honesty, even though, and interestingly, another tie to the program, his early career included laying out railroads, probably including some that play a part in our story. But as many young men do, myself included, his ideas of where he wanted to go changed, and he would start to practice law. Now, back in the day, you didn't go to law school as we do now. You would read law. Generally speaking, you would go with a practicing attorney, a senior attorney, somebody well known in the area, and you would read law. You would basically call it home study, if you will, but eventually you would be qualified to take the exam for the bar. And John would take the exam for the bar and become a practicing attorney. He became more interested in politics and would hold several minor political offices within the county, and he would become largely involved with the Democratic Party, which was not terribly uncommon in that part of the state of Pennsylvania at the time. John would eventually marry Sally Sebring in 1854. Interestingly enough, on my paternal grandfather's birthday, well, several years before, obviously. She was the daughter of a Northampton County judge. So John did pretty well for himself in that respect. And their marriage would do pretty well as well. She would bear him 7 children. Unfortunately, like many families of the time, 2 of the children would die in childhood. A third would actually die on the day of birth. So there would be only 4 who would live to adulthood. They'd be very important with his family. He was very interested in his family. As a matter of fact, his career was directed following the Civil War, largely based on familial concerns. One of the things that John did do while he was in Norristown is he would join the Norristown Rifles, the local militia group, in 1857. And he would have a rise through the military establishment. With the coming of the war in 1861, following the firing on Fort Sumter, on April 15th, President Abraham Lincoln would issue a call for volunteers, 75,000 volunteers, to put down the rebellion. John Hartranft would get on a train following the same tracks that are going to play such an integral part of this story. He would journey to Harrisburg and meet with Governor Andrew Curtin and offer up the services of his regiment, the Norristown Rifles. Curtin would tell him, "Be back here in 2 days with your men, and I'll name you the colonel, but I need you by that time." John would get back on the train, retrace his steps back to Norristown, assemble his troops, as it were, and return back to Harrisburg in accordance with the governor's request. There, he would be named colonel of the 4th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, a 90-day outfit that would be sent to Washington in an effort to guard the Capitol and put down the rebellion. You may have heard, if you've studied the Civil War at all, the early cries throughout the North, "On to Richmond, get on to Richmond and put down this rebellion." Well, for the first 3 months, it was more of an organized rabble than an army. So they really didn't see much in the way of any action, although there was one military fatality when the regiment was sent out on picket duty. By July, the plans of the Union Army finally start to mature, and they begin to move southwest towards Centerville, Virginia, where there's a similar disorganized force of Confederate Army infantry. Unfortunately, in many ways, the term of enlistment for the 4th Pennsylvania expired before they got to the fields that would be known as Bull Run. John would write home to Sally that he thought his regiment was going to do well, that they would stay for the coming fight. He was surely disappointed when all but 6 of them turned around and walked back to Washington at the expiration of their enlistment. Yeah. Literally, they would be accused of having walked away within the sounds of firing, which was really not true. There would also be some shade cast over the fact that one more regiment would have won that battle for the Union Army and the war would have been over. This would follow John Hartranft through a good portion of his subsequent military career. Hartranft himself would attach himself to the staff of Colonel William Franklin, a division commander. He would act as a volunteer aide-de-camp. He would perform heroically during the battle, what would actually become a debacle, more than a battle, of First Bull Run. And of course, it proved the fact that the war was going to be considerably longer. Once he returned to Washington, the term of his enlistment had also expired. He would be mustered out of the volunteer service and return home to his family in Norristown. The war would go on. Efforts would continue to build the Union Army. John would put together a group of men, so many of them from the 4th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, and recruited new 3-year regiment, which would become the 51st Pennsylvania. And that would be the regiment with which he was most associated. They would be mustered into service in November of 1861, and John would be its colonel. He would make quite a bit of history, first in North Carolina with Burnside's North Carolina campaign in early 1862. He would come back, fight at Second Manassas, and then probably his best day is at Antietam, where his regiment, the 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York, would be the regiments that would finally carry the Burnside Bridge on the south end of the field after many hours of trying. And in this painting by Don Stivers, John himself is actually featured urging his troops on the east side of the bridge to get them over to the west side of the bridge. His subsequent career would take him to Fredericksburg, where by this time his commanding officer, Ambrose Burnside, was the commanding officer of the Union Army. For those who studied Fredericksburg at all, you know it was a debacle. The fight before Marye's Heights, the Confederates simply mowed down Union troops as they tried to storm a stone wall, also lined with Confederate artillery. That was December 13th, 1862. The following day, Ambrose Burnside tearfully wanted to lead his own 9th Corps, including the 51st Pennsylvania, in a renewed assault. He was talked out of it, probably fortunately for a whole lot of men, and possibly including John Hartranft, who may not have fared very well in the charge up that slope and against that wall. Burnside would be relieved as commander of the Army of the Potomac, but Abraham Lincoln liked him. Indeed, Burnside was a very likable individual. If you look at his history at all, he's not a scheming man. He's not the village idiot by any sense. He's a nice man who just had the worst possible luck that you could have of a military commander. Burnside would be sent west, and so too would Hartranft and his 51st Pennsylvania. They would eventually end up finding their way to Vicksburg, Mississippi, just before the end of the siege of Mississippi in July, siege of Vicksburg in July of 1863. But the Pennsylvania Memorial on the Vicksburg battlefield features a bas-relief profile of John Hartranft, along with 4 other Pennsylvanians, including John Curtin, Tom Brentholtz, Daniel Leisure, and a hometown hero, George Durrell of Durrell's Battery. Ulysses S. Grant himself would urge Hartranft's promotion to brigadier general from colonel. He had been passed over several times, continually with the shade of the 4th Pennsylvania cast on him. Oh, he was the colonel of that regiment that walked off at Bull Run. We're not promoting him. Grant would urge his promotion. As a matter of fact, because Grant urged it, Hartranft had actually gone out and acquired a brigadier general's uniform coat. Unfortunately, he had to put that back in the trunk because at that point in time, the War Department still remembered this is the guy whose regiment walked off the field. So we're not promoting him to brigadier general. But he would end up coming back east. By this time, Grant has become the hero. He's become the commanding general of the Union Army. And so if he says that John Hartranft is going to be promoted to brigadier general, he's going to get that star. He will become a brigadier general on May 12th, 1864. He will fight throughout the Overland Campaign from Spotsylvania, the wilderness from Spotsylvania down to Petersburg, where in June he will be wounded. not seriously, enough to take him off the field for a little while. But because of his abilities, his skill, and his efforts, he'll be promoted to division command, which means instead of just a brigade, he's now in charge of 3 brigades, and he'll be commanding that division throughout the rest of the war. March 1865, the Confederates, now basically on the ropes, make a final attempt to break out of the trenches around Petersburg in a battle called Fort Stedman. They will actually break into the Union lines. They will take over this redoubt known as Fort Stedman, turn the guns around on the Union troops. It will be John Hartranft's division encamped a mile or so down the road that will assemble and will retake Fort Stedman, push the Confederates back, and close the last breach, the last Confederate offensive of the war. For this, Hartranft will receive a brevet promotion to Major General. A brevet promotion is basically an honorary promotion. You don't officially get it, but everybody calls you a Major General or whatever that you were promoted to. And he would be entitled to wear the 2nd star. The end of the war is now at hand. Lee will surrender at Appomattox. The troops start to head back to Washington, but for his service, he's recognized as somebody who has some ability. He'll be appointed the Provost Marshal General of Washington, D.C. He becomes the warden of the old Capitol Prison. And as soon as he gets there, his first guests for whom he's responsible are the Lincoln assassin conspirators. We've recently, not we, I wasn't involved with it, but recently Hartranft's letter book from this period was discovered, and it was published by Harold Holzer and a co-author. And it indicates in there Hartranft was a very detailed man as far as taking care of his prisoners. It details when they were seen by the doctors, when they ate, what they ate. It's very detailed of the treatment that he gave. And he was a very honorable man. He tried very hard, despite the fact that there was so much animus against those prisoners. He tried very hard to be fair to them. Indeed, he would make special arrangements for Mary Surratt, a special couch for her in the courtroom, special capabilities in her cell. And she also was able to receive visits from her daughter and from her priest. So he was a very benevolent administrator of the prison. He would be mustered out of the volunteer service in January of 1866. He was offered a commission in the regular army, something very unusual for a civilian, but it's a testament to the skill, to the abilities and the bravery that he showed throughout the war, and including what he went through as far as being passed over for command so many times. As a matter of fact, one of his captains, somebody subordinate to him in the 4th Pennsylvania, was promoted to brigadier general and was his senior. So he actually, he should have been promoted sooner than he was, but he was not. Probably at the urging of Sally, instead of accepting that commission, he returned home to Pennsylvania, where, for good or for bad, there was a political calling. Throughout the war, because Hartranft believed very strongly in Abraham Lincoln, his conduct of the war, he was a patriot, a friend of the Union. He transitioned from the Democratic to the Republican Party, and he would become active in Republican Party politics following the war. He would become the Pennsylvania Auditor General in 1866 through 1872. His tenure there was marked by reform, was marked by honesty, was marked by an improvement in the overall conduct of that office and the state's finances. He was well thought of, so much so that in 1873 he would be elected governor. Now, politics, as we know, makes strange bedfellows. So just because he was a war hero, just because he was a great guy and so forth, he would be politicked against by the opposite party. He would be labeled frequently as a woman killer because he was the warden of the prison and would actually end up having to oversee the execution of Mary Surratt following her conviction of being involved in Abraham Lincoln's assassination. So obviously not everybody loved John Hartranft. He would also be a contender for the Republican presidential nomination in 1876. He was still president or still governor at the time. Never really a serious contender. His name came up. He got some votes in the early polling and so forth. He would ultimately throw his support behind a friend, fellow veteran, and fellow governor, Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. And Hayes would go on in a somewhat contested election. Not that we know what a contested election is like. He would go on in the contested election of 1876 to become the president of the United States. Following his governorship, Hartranft would receive some political appointments as the U.S. postmaster and as the collector of the port of Philadelphia. So he would have a long involvement with Republican Party politics. Perhaps one of the low points of John's tenure as governor of Pennsylvania was the incident involving the Molly Maguires, which is a whole other presentation that could go on for days. The Molly Maguires were an alleged group of miners in the coal country, Schuylkill and Carbon County, up into Luzerne County, who got into a lot of fights with the mine owners and with the railroads at the time. It was a largely Irish organization. Some folks, and there's no reason, so for all of you Hartranft descendants, don't throw things at me here. There's no reason to believe that John made any deals on his behalf with the Mollies, although some of his agents are expected or anticipated to have, in turn for a blind eye toward the Mollies, getting the Irish support throughout the coal fields for his reelection in 1876. Interestingly, and here's another, black mark that they throw against John, the day of the execution, June 21st, 1877, in both Pottsville and what was then Mock Chunk. I don't know where they came up with that name, but it's Jim Thorpe today. John was curiously absent from his office when the last-minute pleas for clemency arrived in Harrisburg. Nobody knew exactly where he was. So those who opposed to John, the Democrats, the Irish, and so forth, felt that he deliberately went and hid so that he didn't have to make a ruling on the clemency and anger the railroads and the corporate instances. The bottom line is he wasn't there. There was no clemency issued, and as a result, the Molly Maguires, 6 in Pottsville and 4 in Mock Chunk, were hung. It's interesting too, if you look at the prisons up there, how much like a dungeon they look. So there's a whole story with that. We'll come back to that in just a few moments. John would gain more points, however, later in the year for the way he handled the Great Railroad Strike. The Reading Railroad Massacre, as it was known, the marker's still here. Interestingly, this one's at least at the right place. Tells about the fact that depending whose report you look at, somewhere between 10 and 16 people were killed by the militia as a result of the riot that occurred down at 7th and Penn Streets. The area is still there today. The walls are still there today, where militia troops had rocks thrown at them by people, and they finally opened fire. And this would play a role in Hartranft's future with creating the National Guard. Still, he went a long way to solve the railroad strike, to bring peace back to the railroads and to the coal fields and so forth. So he was given great credit for that. He would, however, end up retiring from politics, at least from elected politics. In the final echoes, he would be the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, the big Union veterans organization, the 19th century version of what today might be the American Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW. He would become the national commander in 1875 and 76 while he was still governor. And based on what he had learned from the Reading Railroad Massacre, he would realize that the militia system of old needed to be reformed. Because indeed, at the Reading Railroad Massacre, two different militia units actually threatened to fire on each other. So he would organize a more professional organization based after the United States Army, which was the forerunner of the Pennsylvania National Guard. Indeed, it would be called the Pennsylvania National Guard. John would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Bull Run back in 1861 as a volunteer. It was not uncommon then for soldiers to receive the Medal of Honor much later than the time of their service, but he would receive the Medal of Honor for that. It's interesting, too, that at the Allentown War Memorial, if you're familiar with that, at 7th and Hamilton Streets, there is atop the monument on the four sides bas reliefs of four Pennsylvania generals: George McClellan, George Meade, Winfield Scott Hancock, and John Hartranft. Now, why McClellan is with three fighting generals, nobody really knows, but he's still there. And why John Hartranft, who really, despite his ability, he never rose to corps command. At best, he was a brevet major general. The others were full major generals. It's interesting that he is on that monument as opposed to another Pennsylvania native who really outranked him and had a better career, and that would be John Fulton Reynolds, who was killed on the first day of Gettysburg. But still in all, he's memorialized on the War Memorial in Allentown. Also, following his death, he would succumb in 1889 to Bright's disease, which is an affliction of the kidneys. His gravesite is honored with an obelisk at the Montgomery Cemetery outside of Norristown. The obelisk was presented by the Pennsylvania National Guard. Throughout the Commonwealth, there are schools named after Hartranft. There are roads named after Hartranft. Indeed, there are both at University Park on the Pennsylvania State University campus named after Hartranft. 10 years later, really about 5 years later, there was talk about further honors for John Hartranft, and an effort was made to commission a statue, an equestrian statue, Civil War uniform, and so forth, that would be located at the Pennsylvania State Capitol. That monument would be completed, and the dedication ceremonies would be scheduled for Friday, May 12th, 1899. That would be 35 years after Hartranft's promotion to brigadier general, finally, in Virginia. Now, interestingly, at the dedication, thousands of people attended, including many of his former soldiers in the 51st Pennsylvania. They would travel by train from the Philadelphia, Montgomery County, Norristown area, up the Reading Railroad to Reading, and then get on the Lebanon Valley branch that would take them to Harrisburg for these ceremonies. President William McKinley was scheduled to attend the dedication, be one of the keynote speakers. However, he was forced to cancel due to illness, and he sent some subaltern, I believe the Secretary of the Interior or something like that, in his place. The 51st Pennsylvania as a group would march to the governor's mansion to pay their respects to Mrs. Hartranft. Sally was there and was a guest of the governor for the night, so they would meet with her before they would return to the station in Harrisburg for their journey home. Hartranft's statue was actually located on the East Plaza at the entrance to the state capitol. Quite the centerpiece, as you can see from this photo, where it would be for the next 28 years. Now we get to returning home. The veterans, many of his friends and colleagues from Norristown would board the train. There were so many, in fact, that there was a special. In addition to the regular train, there was a second train that had to be scheduled to follow the first. The first section that looked very much like this drawing on here was a train. The normal train was train 12. It had 8 cars, weighed about 320 tons all told, and stretched for 175 yards. At the throttle was a veteran engineer named Daniel Wildermuth. The second section, or the special, was led by engine 574, had only 6 cars. That made it about 265 tons and 125 yards long. And again, the engineer was Harry Orrell, who was not quite the veteran that Wildermuth was, but he did have experience on the main line. Now, I mentioned these weights and these lengths because they're going to play into our story in just a few moments. The trains would come down the Lebanon Valley line to Reading. They would arrive in Reading shortly after 8 p.m. And then as the line was cleared, train 12 would be scheduled to leave about 8:30. The special would follow 10 minutes later. At the time, passenger trains received the priority. Freight trains, knowing a passenger train was coming, would need to pull into a siding. It's kind of the opposite way today. If anybody has any train travel, the freight travel gets priority over Amtrak. So they're ready to go. Train 12 will pull out, and at the time, everybody communicated by telegraph, basically. So we don't have the modern communications, the modern signaling system that railroads have today. Train 12 would leave. A telegraph message would come from the Birdsboro station to Reading, telling them that there was a breakdown of the freight train that was supposed to pull into the Monocacy siding. They would send that telegraph message down to the Exeter station. As they arrived at the Exeter station, which we see it's long gone, but this is where it was, as Daniel Wildermuth came around this corner, he saw that there was a red signal, one he hadn't expected. He would bring his train to a stop. Slowly, he didn't do an emergency stop, but he would end up stopping about 100 to 150 yards beyond the station. Railroad protocol at the time would be that in such situations, the firemen or one of the brakemen would get off the train, they would go back to the station and find out what the orders were. Unfortunately, in this particular case, for reasons that we don't know, engineer Wildermuth put the train in reverse and he would back it up about 100 yards so that the brakeman could just jump off the back of the train and go into the station and get his orders. Herein lies the problem. Keep in mind that 100 yards. This is the way the station looked back in 1899. And this is the way things look along that stretch of tracks today. As you can see, there's a little bit more foliage that's encroaching from the south side of the railroads. But basically, the two main lines are there. Some of the side tracks have been removed. But this is the area today versus the area then. Now, the curve I mentioned before is about 350 yards away from the station itself. And if you look at that today, you can see, because there were trees there in 1899 as well, I can't see the station. So I'm not expecting, I'm Harry Orrell, I'm in my cab. I've run this line many times. I know full well that as I go around this curve, I have a 3.5 mile straight run down to Birdsboro. This is the time when I can set my controls. I can perhaps pour myself a cup of coffee, maybe light my pipe, something like that, so I can kind of relax. I'm going to have good vision as soon as I clear this corner. But as we come around that corner and the station now becomes in sight, what he doesn't see is a clear track. He sees the last car on train 12, about 350 yards away. Now, unfortunately, he needs about 400 yards to stop. Now, keep in mind, I mentioned that engineer Wildermuth just took about 100 of those yards away from him. So instead of having enough time to be able to stop, Harry hits the hooks. We all know the trains don't stop on a dime. They don't stop on a pile of dimes. So he's doing everything he can to bring a 53-ton engine and the rest of his cars to a stop as quickly as he can. Sparks are flying from the drivers. Witnesses would testify to this. Those standing on the station steps at the time realized that there was going to be a collision and there was nothing that could be done about it. I-74 will still be traveling at about 12 to 15 miles per hour when it plows into the back of of train 12. It was estimated he needed about 25 more yards to bring it to a full stop. Again, the fact that train 12 had backed up that 100 yards took away any ability for him to make it in time. And as a result, we end up with the deadly crash of two trains. This is the special that Frank Shearer may have seen the newsboys hawking on the morning of his son's birth. This was big national news. Philadelphia, Reading. This was actually in San Francisco's newspaper, and it was also in a London newspaper. And it's interesting, too, because some of the way they would hawk some things in here kind of it goes along with the supermarket tabloids. They were not, journalists of the time were not necessarily shy about really evoking graphic images. I'm not sure that thousands of people met at the hospital train in Norristown. Could have been, but still in all, when it's all said and done, there are going to be 29 dead, 45 serious injuries, an unknown number of minor injuries. I spent a good portion of my career in emergency medical services. We have a special plan in place for mass casualty incidents, classifying patients, so forth. Everybody gets accounted for in some fashion. Those plans never existed back in 1899. So we don't know how many people might have wandered away from the scene with bumps and bruises just trying to get back home or whatever they were doing. One woman was reported to be among the dead, and it was insisted she was dead. And if you follow the news over the next couple of days, well, she's not dead, but she's almost dead. She's going to die. Well, okay, she's doing better now. Ultimately, she will survive. The railroad, their first interest would be to clear the tracks, and literally they would push the wreck train would come down and push the debris over the side of the bank. The local community would turn out to help. I never saw them myself. I grew up a short distance away from the Lorraine station, and the station was still there, but it was claimed that the wood planks on the floor were still bloodstained from the victims that they had brought in there in an effort to treat. A Civil War type of triage, which John Hartranft would have been well familiar with from his time on the battlefield. The well at the station had been pumped dry. There were relief trains sent from both the east and the west, from Reading and up from Norristown, in an effort to get people back home. And again, as I said, for the railroad to reopen, because while the railroad is tied up with this accident, business isn't going on. We didn't have a National Transportation Safety Board or Federal Railroad Administration that's going to do an investigation. Let's clear the tracks and get moving again. There was, in one of the newspapers, which I found particularly graphic, one victim was reported to have been parboiled on the steam boiler of engine 574. Certainly not an interesting way to die. And you can see the damage. The cars at the time were wooden coaches, and it would have been with a 53-ton engine plus the rest of his train coming through. It would not have been difficult to pretty much destroy these cars. The total of the 51st Pennsylvania, these men followed John Hartranft into battle. And that day they had been in Harrisburg to honor him, and they ended up losing their life, not on the battlefield, but on the railroad. John Colston was one. Isaac Billman, who interestingly would factor in the coroner's investigation because it would be his pocket watch, which stopped at the time of the crash. That would be used to identify and specify when the crash occurred and used to time things. Now, hopefully, Isaac kept his watch well timed. us. And George Shaw, who was one of 8 brothers who followed John Hartranft into battle, including a couple who ended up not coming home again, one of whom led the charge in front of Hartranft over the bridge at Antietam in September of 1862. And of course, as I mentioned at the top of the program, Fire Chief John Slingloff, whose body lay on the ground with a young boy, unidentified, guarding him and basically saying he was my best friend in the world. And it was only when they would finally be able to take the fire chief and properly care for him that the boy gave up his vigil over his friend. Joseph Taylor, a black man, the 6th United States Colored Troops, was with this crowd that had gone to honor John Hartranft. Taylor was a porter in the Norristown Hotel, a Union veteran. It's unusual for that time for a black man to have been on a train with white people. But apparently he was so well thought of, the 51st Pennsylvania, those who survived, would form an honor guard at his funeral a few days later. Again, something very unusual for the time. One of the other victims, a civilian, Elmer Ellsworth Shelley. You note that he was born in 1861. His first and middle name, Elmer Ellsworth, was in honor of the first martyr of the Union cause, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, who was killed in Alexandria, Virginia early in the war while he was trying to haul down a Confederate flag. Actually, he didn't try to haul it down, he did, and the owner shot him and killed him. So he would become a Union hero, especially because he was a very close friend and protege of the president, Abraham Lincoln. Particularly tragic touch, Daniel Yoder, recently widowed, had several children. He had come up to Reading on Friday the 12th, I'm sorry. He had come up to Reading on Friday the 12th in an effort to find a job and to visit relatives. His children wanted to stay with their aunt overnight, and he reluctantly allowed them to do so. In the course, and as a result, very possibly saved their lives while he lost his own. And then the woman who was supposedly dead and then maybe dead and then, well, maybe she won't die, who didn't die, was Anna Magdeburg. She had been a stenographer for the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, and she had a promising career, but apparently she suffered a head injury, and it may have changed her life forever because all of the records indicate that she ended up living with her parents in Ashland. There's no record of her ever having a job after that, but she would be able to survive for another 47 years before succumbing at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. Now, an interesting what if. One of the guests at the dedication was Pennsylvania Senator Boys Penrose. Philadelphians, you've probably heard of Penrose Avenue, named after him. He was there. He was returning on the train that night to his home in Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, he was sitting near Chief Slingloff. When the train stopped at the Exeter station, he got up and walked to the forward car, which was the parlor car, in an effort to smoke a cigar. He didn't know why they were stopped, but he was going to take a few moments to do that. As I mentioned earlier, President William McKinley was supposed to be at this dedication. Now, McKinley was in his first term. He's less than a year away from starting his reelection campaign. It's not difficult to believe that coming into a weekend, being with a sitting United States Senator, that I'm going to go back to Philadelphia, meet with some people over the weekend, wrap up some campaign donations, some support for my reelection and so forth. There might have been an extra car added to Train 12, which would have made it about 75 feet longer. And maybe there would have been less than 325 yards there when engine 574 was unable to stop. So if William McKinley had been there, if he had been in the last car, and if he had succumbed to the crash, he would have been succeeded by Garrett Hobart. There's a household name for you as vice president. Some of us have trouble remembering Dan Quayle, but Garrett Hobart, not a large standing person in United States politics. he would have become president of the United States, but not for long because he would die of natural causes 6 months later. Based on the law of the time, Hobart would have been succeeded by John Hay. John Hay was the Secretary of State. John Hay, that name sound familiar to anyone? Yes, it would be that John Hay, Secretary to President Abraham Lincoln. So John Hay would have become President of the United States. Would he, had he become President of the United States, chosen to run for election in 1900? And if so, we may have never heard of Theodore Roosevelt. Could be John Hay's face that would be up on Mount Rushmore instead of Theodore Roosevelt. What if? It's interesting with history. Then what about General Hartranft? Well, in 1927, his statue would be relocated from the East Plaza to the west, off to the corner of the Capitol, where today it's just kind of known to people around the area as the General in the Park, because it's adjacent to the park there. There are those who suggested it was moved because it didn't seem fair to recognize just one governor with a statue in such a prominent place. There are those who would suggest it's because he was a Republican and the Democrats were in office at the time. There are numerous suggestions, but one way or the other, the statue was moved in 1927 and it remains there today. The area right around there is where senior senators get the park. It's kind of a parking space for the Senate. There's an interesting urban legend that takes us back to the Maguires, that there is a Pennsylvania coal region legislator who's unnamed. We don't even know whether or not he's still alive or in office, but apparently he was Irish of descent, and he often threatened after he had a few too many at the local pub that he was going to go get a chain, tie it to his truck, and pull that damn statue down. So hard feelings don't go away over time necessarily. Nobody ever really claims that. That could just be an urban legend. And the people that have been around Harrisburg for a long time, when you mention it, it's sort of like the mafia taking a vow of silence. There are things you don't talk about. So nobody's going to give up who it was that threatened to pull the statue down. Exeter Station was so traumatized by the event that it had to change its name from Exeter to Lorraine. Of course, the township is still there, but Exeter Station is long gone. Lorraine is still there. It's a small community. It's got a school that there. It's got a couple of hundred people who live right around the area. The station was demolished many years ago. It had been an apartment for a while, but it was right on the tracks, and that's not something that they particularly that the railroad, Norfolk and Southern particularly, wants to see. So the station is long gone. Now, what of Earl Scherer, the little baby that we mentioned that came into existence a short time after the accident occurred? Well, Earl would go to work for Carpenter Steel Corporation. He would rise to the position of traffic manager, which was basically the individual responsible for shipping all of Carpenter's steel to wherever Carpenter's steel needed to go, shipping various industries and so forth and so on. He would be in that position until he retired. And in this particular photo from 1963, don't want to date you that far, from 1963, he's in the Reading yards observing the loading of Carpenter steel into a Reading Transportation Company truck. Back in the day, as we know, this was piggyback things before they had the double height container trucks. You would load the trailer and so forth on there, and Earl's in the process of watching them do that. You might note that he's doing that right underneath the swinging bridge. For those who've been around Reading for a long time, the swinging bridge was built in 1886, so it would have been witness to all of the activity in the Reading yards that night, May 12th into 13th, 1899. Now, this becomes important because Earl would get, as a result of being traffic manager, a number of little trinkets from the rail company. They would have rail nights and so forth, and you get little little railroad cars or little things take along, the stuff that you get at the rubber chicken dinners today and so forth, for his work and for his support of the Reading rail system. And he would keep those throughout the rest of his life on a small shelf above his workbench. And he would show them off. He'd go downstairs and polish them, and he'd show them off to his grandson, who spent his time, interestingly, playing not 100 yards away from the location of the accident. He would grow up playing, camping, fishing, shooting, playing football, picnicking, and so forth, just south, few yards from where the Exeter station had been. And probably on this bank where there could still be, if somebody wants to go with a shovel, you might still be able to find some debris. Mm-hmm. And one of the neatest things that Earl had was this particular bronze model of the Reading Company T1 series. Their 2100, 2102. 2102 still remains with the Reading and Northern Railroad. 2124 is up at the Steamtown in Scranton. But this small casting always was attracted to his grandson, and his grandson maintains that to this day, where it sits on my library shelf. Mm-hmm. And now you know the rest of the story. Thank you very much.